Absolutely. So we have got Carol with us from the Conservation Law Foundation. Now, Carol is basically an expert at strategic marketing and communications and has been working at the Conservation Law Foundation for how long now?
Close to 5 years now.
5 years.
Yeah.
She's got a really interesting trajectory with some other amazing advocacy organizations like the YMCA, which we'll get into in a bit.
Yeah,
but yeah, would you like to continue?
Sure. So I actually started out in broadcast journalism. And part of the way that I came to advocacy communications, it wasn't even a thing at the time. You know, we just, I was working in television during what we call the salad years. I mean, we had budgets, we were, just in huge newsrooms, and it was right about the time where the digital interruption just was happening, that newsrooms didn't really change their model, and the newsroom just started falling apart and started failing, and that meant layoffs. So in many ways, I always came into communications with wanting to be a storyteller for change, for good. I wanted to be a truth teller. I was, going into journalism. And I literally had to start thinking as my work was drying up. I got laid off of a job because they laid off half the staff, and so I found myself freelancing. And I was doing well with the freelancing for quite some time, but there was one point where I lost a big client. They decided not to move forward with something that we're doing, and that had been my bread and butter, and everything else was gravy. And I found myself, a lot of my friends don't know this, so the fact we're being taped, but I found myself doing, I went to a temp agency just to make money, because I needed to pay the bills and I needed to eat. And I ended up doing some temp work with the American Bar Association. In many ways, it was kind of a humiliating time for me. I was, doing stuff that my interns did for me, and it was humbling. But as I was doing that work, but it was honest work, and I was, bringing in some money. It was just something to kind of hold me over. As I was doing that work, they were working on death penalty, moratorium on the death penalty. And as they were talking to me, they realized that I had expertise in communications. And so I started helping with, brainstorming about the strategy, et cetera, and that actually led them to pay out my temp agency contract and bring me on as a consultant. And so so it was I was already looking for a way to reinvent myself, but trying to figure out how do I get that entry into it. I was interested in doing works with nonprofits and et cetera. And it was part chance, luck, and part strategic. Like I knew I had to change direction, that the television thing was not working out for me anymore. So that's how I wound up, working in advocacy communications. And from there, I would go on to work at Greenpeace, which is an incredible organization. I always had a great respect for Greenpeace because it tapped into two things. My interest in environmental issues and my activism. I grew up with a kind of crazy activist dad. So that was really feeding two things. And from there, I just went on, and I've always looked at, I've always wanted to work for organizations that did something that I really believed in. And people look at the Y and think, what is that? But the YMCA does incredible work in terms of addressing, wellness issues and childhood obesity. And when I remember when I was moving into a community, I was a new kid in town, the Y was where I met my community, where I first got my network. So when I actually started school, I already had some friends. So the Y meant a lot to me, so it's not as weird as it sounds. I wanted to get back into environmental work. I'd always worked for global organizations, and you need to kick me if I talk too long.
No, you're fine.
But I've always worked for global organizations. But what really attracted me to coming to Conservation Law Foundation, I was familiar with them when Greenpeace had worked with them on some Cape Wind stuff, and there was just so much impact they were having that some national groups couldn't have, because they had that depth of knowledge on the local level. That really is where the progress is happening, especially if you know anything about the federal government. It can be rough to get anything really moving forward there. So what happens on that local level I was just so impressed with that, the progress that was being made. Coal-free New England, Conservation Law Foundation was at the top of that in making New England a coal-free region.
Now, before we go any further,
yes.
Does anyone know what Conservation Law Foundation does? And has anyone heard of the organization before?
And you're going to this is going to show how well I'm doing my job. But it's fine, be honest.
Great.
Okay, I saw one hand. Okay, so we've got our work to do.
Yes.
And I will say that's part of why I came to Conservation Law Foundation, understanding that work to do, because often a lot of the work, Conservation Law Foundation is an environmental advocacy group that is focused on environmental issues in New England. It's New England based. Our headquarters is here in Boston, but we have offices in all the New England states. And a lot of the work that we're doing is really looking for solutions to some very complex problems, complex environmental issues, how we're bringing clean energy on. And a lot of that work is really behind the scenes. We've got the legal acumen, the policy knowledge, and so we are at the table, in many cases, writing the legislation, in many cases, writing that law and making sure that law is enforced. Sometimes that can be very wonky work. And it's, you know, I mean, Greenpeace has a ship and a cool banner, and in many ways, what Conservation Law Foundation is doing is so impactful, but it's largely a lot of litigators and lawyers and policy folks, and they're not the best communicators, and they're not really good at taking this complex work and transforming it into something that's accessible to people that will help, you know, grow the membership, the visibility, so people know who they are. Mm-hmm. And we're starting to, so I'm hoping that one hand that I saw back there will eventually be all of your hands up and understanding what CLF does. CLF has done a great job in talking to the insiders. So when you go on Beacon Hill, or when you you talk to trade organizations or energy experts, they know who CLF is. But that's not how you really can't you can't sustain a nonprofit without having membership and people that are supporting you and individual donations and foundations, so you have to go outside of that insider audience. And so that's the work that we've been doing since I've been there, is really identifying who do we need, because we recognize there are people that would support our work if they ever knew what we were doing. And we even had, so we literally did the homework to figure out, our membership is flatlining, we're not bringing in the numbers, how do we turn that around? And we identified a very specific demographic that you would give to CLF if they knew about our work, and so that's one of our primary targets when we're looking at how we're communicating and talking and reaching those values.
Perfect. So just to ground us, for those of us who haven't heard of CLF or who are unfamiliar with its work, can you give us a couple really big projects where you've been hitting it hard with communications to kind of publicize these projects, get that awareness out? Sure.
So I will talk about, let me just talk a little bit about CLF has been around for over 50 years. And I think the legacy piece work that they did was the cleanup of the Boston Harbor. And at that time, when the Boston Harbor was called the dirtiest harbor in the country. And CLF, when they said they were going to sue the Commonwealth to clean up the harbor, people thought they were nuts. This was groundbreaking at that time, and that's one of the things that's the brand of CLF, is making the impossible possible, really getting down there and doing the hard work to clean up the harbor and ensure that the harbor is accessible to all people. So that's part of the work. And so when we look at what we're doing today, the work that we're doing today is really to ensure that that people are aware of that public access, that there's land that you own, that you have the right to be there, but a lot of developers are trying to wall off people from the harbor and not make it a welcoming place for people. The other part is that part of that protection of that land, now we're looking at how do we ensure that it's climate resilience. As we're aware that, our coastal, especially our coast, are very vulnerable to a change in climate and to sea level rise and extreme weather. And Boston is on the front lines of that. So a lot of the work that we're doing now is ensuring that when developers build a building, that it is climate resilient, that it can withstand the sea level rise that we know is happening. This is no longer, a thing that we're thinking that's coming in the future. It's kind of happening now. So that would be, some of the groundbreaking work that we're doing. We're one of the things that CLF does is we're not afraid to take on the big polluters. We're a small, scrappy team, but we're not afraid to take them on. So we're suing ExxonMobil Very big. And ExxonMobil has a lot of money, but we're suing them saying that you know about this climate change, you know about this sea level rise, yet you have a terminal, an oil terminal right here in, near Boston, in Everett, that if, it wouldn't even take a huge storm to put us all at great risk. So that's, some of the other work that we're doing. And I think a big part of the work that we're doing is ensuring a clean energy future. We were at the forefront of a coal-free New England, and now we're trying to get to a carbon-free New England, really reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and ensure that we're weaning ourselves off of gas and bringing on renewable energy such as solar and offshore wind, which is no longer this pie in the sky. These are affordable solutions that can happen now. So. Yeah.
So now that we've kind of set the groundwork, is everyone feeling a little more comfortable understanding CLF, what they do? Give me some vague nods if we are. Yeah, great. I do want to encourage everyone, Carol and I talked about this, if you have any questions during our presentation, if you will, please raise those hands. We want to hear your voices, we want to hear what's on your mind. So I'll kind of transition now, Carol, to talking a little bit about theory. Mm-hmm. So what do you see the intersection is between marketing, communications, and advocacy, and how have you been specifically employing this tool in CLF's work? So
one thing to understand about advocacy communications is marketing. And that's something that a lot of nonprofits, because it's like, we're doing social good, but you are marketing an idea. And that's some of the most difficult marketing that there is, that you are selling a vision for how we can make the place, a better world. I know I sound like Miss America, but I'm speaking very, very generally, very broadly. So that is what you are selling. And what you have to do is you have to educate, you have to inspire, and you have to mobilize people. So that's kind of the journey that you're taking them on. And you have to do that in a landscape. When I think about when I first got into communications on the advocacy side, it was really a one-sided conversation. The digital explosion, I know I'm aging myself and you might not remember, there was a time when digital wasn't really a player, not like it is today. But now we realize that it's a two-way conversation. It's no longer, it used to be, we did something, we would send a press release out, you were on the news, and that was your communications plan. It's much, much more complicated now. So one of the first things, one of the biggest, I think the biggest challenges for nonprofits is finding that space to plan and have a strategy. Because trust me, the other side does. They're very, very good at this. The fossil fuel industry is excellent because they've got the resources, they've invested in it, they've known before we even realize that there's actually a science and a theory to advocacy communications. They've known that so we're way behind. And so I think one of the things I'm always saying is that you have to tell me the journey that you're taking me on. You have to tell me what is your goal, but you also have to set goals that I understand, that are measurable, that are achievable. So when I look at the environmental movement and stop global warming, that didn't mean a whole lot to anybody. It was this really up there. It's like, how does that relate to my everyday life? And I think that's one of the things that the environmental movement has learned is that we have not done a great job of communicating and relating that work to people's everyday values and beliefs. Mm-hmm. And so what you're seeing now is that shift. We used to kind of be that helicopter, and people saw environmentalists that you're always telling me what I can't do. You don't have solutions, and these are all true. These are fair criticisms. You don't have solutions. You're always telling me what I can't do. Can't drive this car. I'm doing this. And when we were talking about climate change, where the other side had spokespeople, we had scientists and experts that were ill-equipped to go up against these really slick PR people. So we really were losing the public. We really lost that battle for a long time. And that has started to change. And part of that, when you look at somebody like Al Gore, was making this a very real issue. And not just the fear-mongering, but also what is that solution? Because people also get turned off if you just keep going on. Mm-hmm. So looking at this is, that climate change is costly, it affects our economy, that climate change impacts the public health, bringing public health back into it, and that we can make our communities climate ready, and that they can thrive in this new reality of climate disruption. And we're even talking about, there's even talks, see, it's communications is always evolving. We're always talking about how we change and test that message. And that's the other thing that nonprofits have to do, is take that breath to test your message. And it doesn't have to be expensive focus groups. It can be grassroots, where you're just going out to some audiences to see what works. But we found out that global warming, for example, am I answering your question?
Yes, you're going.
I do that sometimes.
I got you.
I do media training that don't do this, and I'm rambling. But global warming, when you look at something like global warming, we realize that for many people, global warming sounded like, that's not really bad. Climate change sounds a little bit innocuous. So more and more we've been talking about, we need to start talking about climate disruption as being a more apt description of what's happening, where people can, at least when I hear the word, I get what that means. Climate change means absolutely nothing. But that doesn't sound bad.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
No, that's really, and I wanna bring it back to something that you mentioned, which is the utilization of spokespeople.
Yeah.
Specifically, you mentioned Al Gore. So how do you think in CLF's advocacy communications are you mobilizing relatable spokespeople to convey your message?
So one of the things that we do is that we train them to do that. Lawyers, and I'll speak specifically to lawyers, scientists as well, tend to want to be precise. And being precise, one thing you have to realize is that when we talk about this changing communications media landscape, there's not a lot of room for a lot of chatter. We are getting billions of content. For example, how are people getting their news? I know all of you must be getting your news in different ways.
Shout it out.
Shout it out. How do you get your news?
Mobile.
Okay.
Mobile.
Podcasts,
newspapers, I'm hearing. So I'm hearing everything, and I myself, one thing I realize is that when I get news, a lot of times it's coming through some sort of aggregated list that I have, or it's being shared. Twitter is where I get my breaking news, and it's really easy to, it's pretty intense. And who has Twitter? Okay, so do you see how quickly your feed moves along? And when you look at traditional media spaces, print, broadcast, all of them have an online component now. And so it's no longer, it's old news like in an hour, because they're constantly updating the content, on their sites. So when you look at that kind of all of that stuff that's coming to us so quickly, you have to be able to have accessible messaging that people can understand. You have to have that frame.
Mm-hmm.
And so let me see if I can read this, because it's so dark in here, because I actually wrote this down, because this is what came to me as from one of our attorneys. So it said that he wanted to ban funding mechanisms for risky gas pipeline infrastructure that would have to be funded by ratepayers. Who in here knows what a ratepayer is? Okay, I see two hands. Okay, who here do you realize that you are a ratepayer? Does anyone know this? That they are a ratepayer. Basically, a ratepayer is it's families, business, people that are using our energy. You are ratepayers. But when you use this insider language, you already lose people. Like, that meant nothing to me. So what we did was we developed a campaign. People over pipelines, because basically what that sentence I just said meant was that they wanted to tax you, consumers, people, to build a pipeline. That's in a very simple way, accessible way. You understand that, right? Does that sound like something that's fair? Does anybody, as soon as you say tax, people don't want to do it. So it's really about training training our legal advocates how to talk about things in an accessible way. Mm-hmm. And so when we looked at, that was the goal of what we're trying to reach. And then we talk about who is going to be moved by this? Like, who's the audience that's going to make this happen? A lot of it will be the people that are living where they're trying to dig up their communities to build this pipeline. So we looking at those, so we had that built-in constituent that's ready to hear that message. So that's how you start building an advocacy campaign, if that makes sense. You know, you look at your goal, you know, what are you trying to do? And then you look at what are the values and, you know, who do you need to get there? And then you have to speak to those values of what people care about. And that's something the environment is learning, is that you can't just talk about saving beautiful natural places. Why should I care about this? You know, you have to talk about, you just can't talk about climate change and lead in water. Like, what does this mean in my life? Environmental issues are public health issues in many cases. You know, but we've taken public health out of the conversation for quite some time now. EPA was a public health agency. It's a public health agency, environmental protection agency. But the language and how we've been talking about it, they've completely gotten away from that. You know, we're talking about the economy. Coal's expensive. Fossil fuels are expensive. They're not sustainable. So, but we weren't talking about it that way.
Yeah.
So,
it's interesting you say that too, because framing is such a difficult tool to really employ successfully. And I think something that any communicator can voice a struggle with is effectively framing when you have strong opposition. So what have you found, in addition to plotting out values, a journey, goals, what, for example, platforms have you found that you can effectively frame on and get a message through stronger? Just what techniques have you found really work?
So what I have found works is that you can lose, when you're a nonprofit, you can't afford to spend a lot of money without a strategy. So that's why it's so important to know that goal and know who you're trying to reach. And understanding, doing your homework to figure out where does that audience get their news from? You know, so that's really important. Now, I'll give an example. We were working feverishly to create the first marine national monument. Part of the trick of that is that, unlike a land monument, you don't visit it. No one's ever going to see this marine national monument. So we really had to speak to the importance of what this means by making it by protecting this part of the ocean. And also making the analogy that this is, in many ways, we're creating these blue parks. I don't love all the messaging around this, so this isn't the best example because I don't think we quite got there. But one thing that we looked at was, who are we trying to reach? Like, who can make this happen? Where are the points that can pressure the Interior Department to make this into a monument, and for Obama to eventually sign it, which Trump might roll back, but anyway, that's another story. And so we started looking at people who really embrace the ocean. We started looking at the recreational fishing industry. We looked at whale watching tours and places where a healthy ocean really means a lot to them. And a community that we tapped into, which was a big kind of surprise for us, was the surfing community. You know, so this was a completely new community. And so looking at how they're receiving information, you know, social media was really big for them. Instagram is huge, a very visual group. And the other thing that we did was we realized we had to take people into this area. So we partnered with Brian Scarry, who's a diver, National Geographic, and he went on a dive and literally took pictures, and we created a video. And we used this video for house watching parts. We did two versions, a much longer one. We did a video which we marketed on social media platforms such as Facebook, and it became a real tool for us in talking about this work and getting people to sign the petition and really take action, and eventually we got a marine national monument, the first one in the Atlantic Ocean. So I'm telling this story really simply. It was hard work. You know, it was many groups working together, coalitions working together, and this just brings up another trigger about the coalition. The other part that's really, you're not just competing with all the other issues that are out there. There, you know, healthcare, education. There's so many nonprofits. When I was in D.C. especially, you're also competing within the environmental movement. So you constantly have to have some pointy elbows and really define what you're uniquely qualified to lead and what's your piece of it. And working for a regional organization especially, you've got NRDC, Sierra Club, all these groups that have way bigger memberships than you do. They are better known. They have brands that are known. I mean, how many people have heard of Sierra Club? I bet you more hands are going to go up now. Actually, not as many as I thought. Really? What about NRDC? The environment sucks.
We're not doing a good job.
We are doing terrible. This is. I wish the camera could flip around so we could see. National Resource Defense Council. A bad acronym, but I thought that it would be.
What about the WWF? Everyone's seen the panda, right? And that's a big symbol.
Okay.
That's a popular symbol, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. But I say that to say that in many ways, we were the regional group that was at the table, but we had something that they don't have, and that's that depth of knowledge of the constituents here in New England, which were critical to get this moving on the federal level. And so we had to own that. And there's a tendency for when I first got to CLF to be kind of apologetic and giving and, NRDC, and it's like, no, CLF, this is our piece. They've got the numbers that they can deliver, but we can really move the constituents here, the representatives here in New England, like that's ours.
Yeah.
And once you understand that, coalitions are fabulous. We can all get along, but it can be tense as you're working that out on what that part is.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important opposition in terms of who's directly against our values and goals, but not necessarily what other competitors are out there within the same field. So I think you bring up a fascinating point.
It's sometimes it's hard to understand that, because when you're doing social good and not realizing the marketing components, it's also in many ways a business. We have to bring money in to support the work. And that's the part that you don't really think about. You're just like, I'm going out to do good, but you can't do good if you have no funding. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, we have a couple minutes left, and I want to ask you one potentially tangential question.
Mm-hmm.
So politics and advocacy are so intricately tied,
mm-hmm.
right? Like, we've seen how the EPA has drastically changed under the current administration.
Yes.
How do you navigate continuing long-term goals and projects with an ever-changing political system where your constituencies are changing, your coalitions are changing, the very framework which you're operating under and pursuing these lawsuits under are changing?
Absolutely.
What's the strategy for that?
So the strategy for that is understanding that landscape and that change. And I think it's one of the reasons that I'm really grateful for working on a regional level, but still even on the regional level, we have our own Trump, whose name is LePage in Maine. Where you're always, so it's not easy, but it's, we in November 8th, there's, we're already planning a teleconference to kind of talk to our members about what's that going to mean for the work that we're doing. So it's that constant battle, is that, you have to continue progressing on stuff that's moving forward, but you also have to defend current laws and make sure that you're giving them teeth. And you have to make sure that you have a diverse strategy, a multifaceted strategy, that you're not just depending it. You can't be a one-trick pony relying on the EPA. You never could. The EPA has always been, even under the best administrators for us, what we consider the best administrators, has always been overworked, overstrapped. So always looking for ways that you can work on the local level, in the municipal level. I've just said municipal, and I tell people to never say municipal. The city and town level. See, they're ruining me. And the state level, and make sure you're working all those levels. Making sure that it's, you have to look at the legislation, you have to look at the law, and you do have to think outside of the box. And sometimes really sitting down. What CLF does very well is really sitting down with unlikely allies of the environmental movement. We sit down with developers in business, and there are groups, like Greenpeace, where I worked, that would never, it feels like we're making that compromise, but you have to have people coming from those different perspectives to really get any solutions on the table. And you do need the Greenpeace that's going to, no compromising, we hate everybody, and that's not true about them, but you do need somebody who's also waving the flag, but you also need the pragmatic groups like CLF that are willing to say, okay, how can we all get to this point where we're meeting? That said, this is an unprecedented administration, so we all had to take a breath and go, oh, wow. and be honest about that. And one group that I was most impressed with, I will say, when when it was unexpected that Trump was going to get into office, and ACLU also saw that a lot of their work could be, there were going to be a lot of challenges, was that they had sat down and prepared for that scenario. And they were out the gate the day the election was announced, and they sent out that infographic, which got them all that money that I'm so jealous of, as they said, President Trump will see you in court. That was their message. Simple as that. I cried and I gave and became a monthly member. So, and they raised more money in that one night than they'd raised in like 8 years or something insane like that.
That's amazing. Because
they were ready for it. They sat there and they said, and everybody else was like, it's not, we're fine. I mean, we kind of said, oh, maybe, but while we were all scrambling like, ugh, they were out the gate with a message that resonated with a significant amount of people, and then they started filing lawsuits.
Well,
CLF is fabulous.
we have some time for questions. Y'all have been particularly quiet.
You have it. I don't know what is this. I've never seen communications people, because a lot of you are communications folks, right?
So raise those hands.
Am I boring? Am I like?
I think the problem a lot of people have is that their basic grasp on climate change stuff surrounding it is so science-based.
Yeah.
Communication is also not a blanket statement. In fact, a lot of us are not. How do you suggest help us bridge that gap? People who don't necessarily, I want to be more knowledgeable about science and about this kind of stuff. I just a lot of times don't know where to start myself.
Sure. Well, and it is daunting, and what you're asking is, he's like, where do I find out about what's going on and how to learn about it? And you can start with sign up for CLF's blogs and e-news. I have to say it to get, but I say that because our blogs, our chief content officer has really done a great job of transforming our blogs so they are so accessible and giving information. Environmental groups are still trying to get there in how we communicate and really make this material accessible, and we're not there yet. But I do think that there are some groups, such as Conservation Law Foundation, that are helping to kind of break down how we talk about it. We've been doing things that have worked really well for us, called animated explainer videos, where we actually explain things like, what do we mean by carbon pricing, and we do a little animation around it. That we're the trick with that is, how do you make sure that's getting out to people? And so I'm not sure we've been as successful as that. But those are, and we literally put out things about how to talk about this work and that type of thing. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I always find when I really want to understand something is also, I don't hate to say it, but the new journalist, a good environmental journalist, is really good at breaking something down, because they have to break it down for a more general audience, and to a 4th or 5th grade level if you're the New York Times, and even lower outside of that. So reading, WBUR has an environmental investigative unit now. Really following that, following the stories that they're doing is a really, because they also put the human voice to it. So it's not just this thing called climate change, but really explaining it to it in very human terms. So that's another good way to do that work. Yeah.
You mentioned getting involved in the surfing community.
Get involved in what?
The surfing community.
Yes.
One of your projects. I have this theory that the second climate change impacts football, everyone's going to be all set, because all the southern states and governors that are on
that. I'm taking it back. That's a good point.
But do you have other recommendations on how to reach people? A lot of people I talk to, I lived in Texas for a while.
Right.
Who you think have scoffed at climate change and stuff like that.
Yep.
You say, well, you don't think this is it. They'll say, I think this is it. I just think it's very important to worry about. How do you hit home for a lot of these people?
Let me just repeat the question.
Sure.
So the question was, how do you communicate effectively with people who maybe are climate change deniers or aren't open to your messaging? How do you get that message across?
And I think it's meeting people where they are in terms of their value. And you talk about Texas. This is another case and not CLF, but there was a big littering problem there, and they wanted to decrease littering, in Texas, and people just didn't care. So what they ended up doing was this campaign around, but what Texas does care about is pride, state pride. And so they did a big campaign around "Don't mess with Texas." Texans don't litter. I forgot the tagline on it, but they played off of that pride, and so it was talking about not littering because it's a bunch of environmentalists saying that's really bad for the earth. It was talking about Texas pride. We have pride. We want to bring people into our state. This is about our economy and bringing money and boosting tourism, and we don't want to we want to look good as we and it worked. And so I think that it's so important, because when you're talking about climate change, for example, climate disruption and extreme weather, talk to the small business owner and talk about how much money we lost that first winter I moved here, where we had back-to-back blizzards. It put people out of business. Those people who never cared about climate change are ready to talk about it now. And the extreme weather piece, I keep going back to that, because that's something that I think is happening everywhere. I can't think of a region of the country where you're safe from that extreme weather. So people are starting to see it, and losing homes and finding out how bad your insurance is when you try to rebuild. So I think it really is talking about the economic impact of it. And it really depends. You really have to do, and that's why I said there's no easy answer to that, because you really have to do your homework with who you're trying to reach. Do that homework and test it out. It doesn't have to be expensive focus group testing. It could just be anecdotal, but just, talk to folks about what they care about, because I think it's true. We all know that climate change is important. We probably should care about it, but there's a lot going on in my life right now, and, I'm still trying to make sure my health insurance is sorted, and, there's just a lot, immigration rights and there's just a lot going on right now. So you really have to get to what I care about, and the economy is something that resonates with a lot of people.
Speaking of the intersectionality behind climate change and the need for this environmental movement, we have a lot of engineers here today, and that's really interesting. So how do you see those two playing together? And maybe the engineers can speak up. I'm sorry, I'm spotlighting you a little bit. What brought you here? Why are you interested in the environmental movement? What capacity has that intersected with your engineering work?
Because you guys are critical to this, just so you know, but go ahead. I'd be interested. Who are the engineering students?
They're not. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Well, would you like to talk about why it's so critical?
Well, when you look at, I tell you, some of the, when you talk about the climate resilience and making communities climate resilient, engineering is a huge part of that. How we design our towns, how we build. So city planning and, that type of engineering is really hot right now. The Dutch are just making, just being flown all over the country to talk about how they dealt with, in the Netherlands with, the canals and how they build. And I know there was a big contest here to talk about how are we going to make Boston, because Boston is on the front line. How are we going to make Boston a climate resilient, where the communities are not going to be underwater, and how do we build, because building is happening every day. The seaport, they're building without any thought to how to make these buildings climate resilient. So that's one way that engineering plays a big role in making, and I don't really like the word climate resilient. I'm using it now, but we're changing that, to make, communities climate ready and climate prepared. How do y'all like that messaging? I'd like to hear back. Sure.
Speaking about engineering, there are methods that have been taken by countries on the cusp of actually the front running facing whatever effects of climate change that will happen, like Japan or India and rural communities, where the locals come up with ingenious ideas to face climate change or use clean energy. Do you think that at this position, with the technological advances that Boston or USA has, we can get about easy engineering methods to face all of the problems that's going to happen or is happening?
I see no reason why the United States should be at the forefront of this, and it's tragic that they're not. And the thing I like about thinking about what's happening on, regional, state levels, when you look at Boston and the kind of innovation and technology, the technology center that we have here on the East, I just don't see how you can't have, technology and innovation plays such a critical role. And I think we have a real opportunity that we have not fully tapped into yet, but we need to.
What, according to you, are the blockers that is existing?
I think it's been politicized, so that's part of it. I think that we're good at. I think it's a big problem, that we kind of ignored for so long, and so we're kind of in the midst of it. But I think we've got to get outside of the government. We really need businesses to step up, private enterprises, to really make that commitment, because it's not happening on the local level. Even in a city as progressive as Boston, and Mayor Walsh probably has one of the best climate resilient plans that I've seen written on paper. But if you don't put any budget behind it or any action behind it and make that a priority, it's not going to happen. So I would love to see, academia step up, for example, and come to the table and really create that outside of the political system, frankly.
Don't be shy. I have a question for you, and it's okay if you don't want to answer this.
Oh my God, cut that part out if I don't, yeah.
But there has been a lot of controversy surrounding the upsizing of the Boston Harbor Garage near South Boston by the aquarium.
Right.
Has CLF been involved in that in any extent, and what sort of capacities have you seen involvement in? Is it like a social justice capacity? Is it a harbor access capacity? Because this is a very current controversy.
So we have been very involved in a lot of and a few things that have been developed, not specifically on the garage, but a few things of the developments that are happening on the seaport. And one of our major concerns is that there's been a lot of, there's a law that we have, we refer to it as Chapter 91, but it's basically talking about how you're developing on the seaport, because the tidelands actually belong to the public, and they have, when somebody builds, they have to ensure that there's a public benefit for residents that are living in the area, and sometimes that's access, making sure that how many of you realize that the Intercontinental Hotel, that lawn they have out front with that's public land? You realize that? And that you don't have to buy anything, and you can just sit there with your own drink and your own food and enjoy. So we're very involved in ensuring that we're bolstering that Chapter 91, and we're kind of looking project to project on what ones that we're saying where they're not following the laws, and they're building, and we haven't been as involved in the aesthetic, but that's part of it as well.
Sure.
And the shadow laws and all of that. So we are involved, very involved with the waterfront development.
All the way in the back.
So I teach the media advocacy seminar to graduate students here. First of all, it's like a great one. One of the things that some of the students and I have been talking about is the tension between kind of elite agendas and grassroots agendas.
Yes.
And people have talked a lot about what happened to the environmental movement, this very broad-based movement that helped bring about the Clean Air Act and the Water Act, Earth Day, got a Republican administration in the 70s to set up the EPA.
Yeah.
And now it has really it's fighting an uphill battle on every front. And some of the critiques are that the environmental movement has become a lawyer's movement, and has failed to engage the grassroots. Sort of subset of that is this idea that there may be a fundamental tension, Risha's and I've talked about this a little bit, between sort of environmental justice framing
Yes.
and the kind of what you brought up, the sort of climate change, global warming,
Yeah.
kind of Washington-centric messaging. So we're just putting a lot on the table. How do you think about that grassroots elite tension
You are absolutely right, and that's part of what that's part of what the problem has been, is that the environmental movement has shrunk so much. It's not been inclusive, it's not been a diverse movement, and that diversity environmental report comes out every 10 years, and it just, breaks your heart when you're like, oh God, you really haven't moved any further on that. And it's everything I'm talking about today. Part of it is bad messaging. Part of it is not listening. Going into communities, and instead of, understanding what people understand, what they want from in their communities, and there's just a lot of assumptions. So it's a very elite, affluent, white movement. Be clear about that. And that's not a movement that's going to, you can't, that's not sustainable. You're not going to make change if you're not going to include this, this rich fabric. And it's BS that, people of color, or people that they need to be connected to nature to understand, or they care about it. People care now. But you have to meet people, they know what they care about. These are people that are on the front lines of, environmental catastrophe, sea level rise, all of that. EJ communities are on the front line of all of that. Displacement, all of that are huge issues. And so it's about, making sure that you're working with communities and not helicoptering down and telling them what needs to be done. But you do need lawyers.
One of the things about all of this is that, there's a case to be made that the effects of climate change will be just so unequally distributed.
Yes.
Katrina in New Orleans may or may not be a climate change-induced event, but if we think of it as a paradigm of what will happen,
Yep.
people's needs are just going to be able to move, they're going to be able to escape, they're going to...
Right.
And so, there's a case to be made that you should only focus on people who don't have the means, and forget about the rest of them, because they have plenty of money to bail themselves out.
Yeah, I don't know that you can, I just think that we firmly believe that we work for all people, and we want to thrive in New England and have a thrive in New England, we strongly believe that there need to be strong climate laws, in every New England state, and that's protecting everyone. And of course, the most vulnerable communities are communities that need to be prioritized and focused on. There's no doubt about that. I completely agree. I don't think that we'd want to silo off and just suddenly say, okay, you guys take care of stuff, and we're just going to focus. But I do think that, we recognize, I think most environmental groups recognize that, it's the EJ community, the environmental justice, and do people even know what EJ communities are? See, this is what I mean.
Define it for us.
Yeah.
Really helpful.
So EJ refers to environmental justice communities, and these are vulnerable populations, low income, often people of communities of color, and often are on the front lines of things such as toxic. You look at lead in water, toxic contamination, and
Yeah.
pretty much yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by environmental justice community. And please stop me when I do the acronyms. So.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Was that a hand? Are you all the way in the back?
Speaking of controversies, I'm very curious to know.
Why don't you stand up so I can see your face? Yeah, okay, because I know we're doing all this. No.
Speaking of controversial topics, I'm very curious to know about the conservation CLF's take on the Northern Pass project that's going on in Vermont, about the clean source, because I have read about the repeated attacks on a project that will provide clean energy to Massachusetts and its nearby regions, and would be finished in lieu of public service, would be finished 2 years earlier than the competing.
You talking about Northern Pass?
Yeah.
We don't like Northern Pass.
Yeah, I'm curious to know about it.
Yeah, we are against Northern Pass. First of all, we are against the build out of.
What is Northern Pass?
Northern Pass is a big gas transmission pipeline that they're building through. It would go through some precious areas in throughout New Hampshire, so it's going to tear up some, really nice land. And part of the reason that we're against that particular pipeline is because it's kind of, by the time that pipeline comes online, it's really not even going to meet the energy needs that we have now. And we're trying to wean off of gas, not build. So it's a cost issue. It costs too much. It's going to tear up some beautiful landscape, and it's not even going to be needed by the time it comes online. So that's why we're not supporting Northern Pass.
I think it resulted in an agreement coming with the TDI. Could you elaborate on that?
I'm sorry, the what?
So, because you don't like Northern Pass, I think I read that it ended up the CLF having coming to an agreement for public service and better alternates with the TDI. I think this is in Vermont. Could you elaborate on that, please?
I have no idea. I can't because I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about. I'm sorry. I'm the communications person, so I'm taste great, less filling. So it might be, you might be asking something deeper than one of our energy people, because I really don't, I'm not sure exactly what you're speaking of. In Vermont?
Yeah, as a result of the Northern Pass proposal.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to send me an email with your question, I can answer it, but I honestly don't know what you're talking about. Sorry. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much,
Thank
Carol.
you.
This was wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you all for coming and for having me, and I hope that it was useful, and I should encourage people, because it dawns on me how much work I have to do in talking and realizing people don't know anything about these issues, and so this has been very helpful for me as well. So thank you.
Carol, if people want to send you a note, where would they get an email I can write here?
Yes, C. Gregory.
Gregory
At CLF.org.
CLF.org. Great.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was great.
Yeah.
Great job. I
Thank
thought you had to
you.
leave.
Thank you. I do.